Okay, so the last section that we're going to cover by video is cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is the process in which energy is released from food molecules and stored in bonds of ATP so that it can be accessed readily when the cell requires it to do work. There are 4 phases in cellular respiration. For some organisms, they will only ever go through the first phase, which is glycolysis. But for those like us who undergo aerobic cell respiration, after glycolysis, we'll have 3 other phases. So the first phase, glycolysis, glyco stands for sugar, and lysis stands for splitting. So they're going to split glucose, the 6-carbon sugar, into 2 3-carbon sugars. It occurs in the cytosol, in cytoplasm, and it releases a very small amount of ATP, usually 2 ATP. Okay. The second phase is called activation. We'll refer to it as activation or transition reaction. In order to go into the next stage, which is the Krebs cycle, the pyruvate, or the molecule that's produced at the end of glycolysis, has to be converted into another form so that it can enter the mitochondrion. The process releases CO2 and it produces a molecule, let's see, I'll write it on here. Produces acetyl CoA. So you may see that in your assignment. Okay. So the acetyl CoA is a form that can enter the next phase, which is called the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle has another name as well. Oftentimes it's called the citric acid cycle because one of the compounds that's in the citric acid cycle is citric acid. It's the starting material, so that's why it gets that name. The Krebs cycle is a series of reactions that happens in the matrix of the mitochondrion. Remember, the mitochondrion is the powerhouse of the cell, so because this is the process that gets us all the energy out of our food stuff, it makes sense that these larger phases are happening in the mitochondrion. In the process, a small amount of ATP and most of the carbon dioxide that we produce are released. So this activation part up here releases some carbon dioxide, but the Krebs cycle ends up releasing the most. Okay. The fourth phase is the electron transport chain. And this is a series of reactions in which carrier molecules pass electrons from one carrier to the next. And as they do so, energy is released. The carriers are found on the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, so along the cristae or folds. And a large amount of energy is released, which is coupled with production of ATP for the organism. So most of the ATP that's produced is produced at this part or during this phase. The last electron carrier in the electron transport chain is oxygen. So this is really, really important. This is why we have to make sure we have oxygen available to us. Okay? If it's not there, then nothing can go through the activation, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. It is the ultimate thing that will accept the electrons and produce the ATP. And it's kind of a driving force that makes the other phases happen. When it picks up the electrons and hydrogens that come with it, it forms the water that's given off in the process. Okay? So the number of phases and the amount of ATP produced depends on the type of organism and the amount of oxygen available. This is kind of, I guess, a visual to help you put the phases in order. So the first phase is glycolysis. So in this case, the glucose is going to be split apart. Sugar is split to give you two 3-carbon molecules of pyruvate. Okay. ATP, a small amount, is given off in the process. A net gain of 2 ATP. So 2 are used up, 4 are made, so net yield is 2 ATP. Like we said, this one occurs both in anaerobic conditions or aerobic conditions. So anaerobic means no oxygen, and aerobic means oxygen present. It takes place in the cytosol, and we get 2 pyruvate molecules and some ATP given off. This diagram is showing what happens next. So it depends on what kind of cell we're talking about and the oxygen levels that are available. So the first arrow is showing what happens in our muscle cells. So if we're overexerting our muscles or if we're running for a long period of time, then eventually the oxygen supply in the muscles gets low. When it's down really low or when there's none left, then the pyruvate, instead of going into the other phases of cell respiration, it will be converted to lactic acid. So when you get your muscle cramps, that's what's happening. If we're talking about yeast and bacterial cells, then these 2 pyruvate will be converted to ethanol, ethyl alcohol. Okay, so we actually we use this to our advantage in industry. We use yeast cells in order to undergo this process, which is known as fermentation. So you should know that it's called fermentation. And in the fermentation, we produce different alcohols. Some people may have seen it happening at home where they're producing beer or wine, but in the process, ethanol is produced, so alcohol, and you'll see some bubbles being produced, and those bubbles are carbon dioxide. When there's sufficient oxygen present, so in other words, under aerobic conditions, our pyruvate molecules will become activated. Okay, so they become acetyl coenzyme A, and they'll enter the mitochondrion. When they're in the mitochondrion, then they can undergo phase 3 and phase 4. Okay, so the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain in order to get much more ATP and carbon dioxide. Let's take a quick look at the mitochondrion. We saw it before, but this is a little more detailed, so you'll understand when we talk about the different phases where exactly they're taking place. It is the site of aerobic cell respiration, so when there's sufficient oxygen present, then it will take place. These reactions will take place in the mitochondrion. Like the chloroplast, it has a double membrane, and in this case, the inner membrane is folded, and the folds are called cristae. These folds, so the membrane on the inside, are studded with enzymes and electron carriers that are involved in the electron transport chain. The matrix is the solution inside, in the very center, and it is the site of the Krebs cycle. Okay, so the Krebs cycle takes place in the matrix, and ETC, or electron transport chain, takes place along the inner membrane. You will be given a diagram so that you can label these yourself. Okay, but I'll label them with you in case you're referring back to it. Let's see. This one is pointing to the outer membrane. Where'd my text go? Okay, this one is referring to um, referring to the inner membrane, just one section of it. If it's pointing to the folds like this one, it's the inner membrane folded, so it's pointing to a few of the folds. They are the cristae. This line here is pointing to the space between the two membranes, so this is the intermembrane space. And the blue stuff in the center is the matrix. Okay. The last one, which I don't really expect you to know, is pointing to the little enzymes that are inside. Okay. So this is another diagram like the one that you had for photosynthesis. So there will be some things missing on your test, but you'll have most of this diagram to refer to. So key thing here is to be able to look at it and get as much information as you can from it. So if you look carefully, cell respiration will start with glucose. So if we start over here with glucose, the first stage is glycolysis. Oops, I have a text box and I don't want it. Sorry. We'll go with red. Okay, so the first stage, wow, that's a really big red. Oh, first stage is glycolysis. Remember, it's splitting of the sugar, so splitting the glucose in order to give us 3-carbon pyruvate molecules. Okay, in the process, ATP is given off, and we get a net yield of 2 ATP here. Second stage or second phase is activation. Okay, where the pyruvate is going to lose carbon dioxide in order to form acetyl coenzyme A. So this 2-carbon molecule is actually acetyl coenzyme A, acetyl CoA. So some of the carbon dioxide that we're breathing out is coming from this activation step, but most of it is going to come from the Krebs cycle. So if we follow the arrows, this acetyl coenzyme A is going to enter the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle takes place in the matrix, so inside of the solution that's in the middle of the mitochondria. There'll be enzymes there that will help carry out all the reactions. So if we look, what was coming in was the acetyl coenzyme A. There'll be molecules that will be recycled to keep the cycle going, but what comes off is carbon dioxide. This is where we release most of the carbon dioxide we breathe out, and a bit of ATP. Not very much there either. Products from the Krebs cycle are, other products are known as electron carrier molecules. They're coenzymes, and they will carry electrons to the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is the 4th phase. Okay. The Krebs cycle was the 3rd phase. The electron transport chain is the 4th phase. The very final electron acceptor, remember, is oxygen. So oxygen has to be here in order to pick up those last electrons and the hydrogens that go with it. When it does so, it forms water. So water is given off. At the same time, or in the process, a lot of ATP, most of the cell's ATP is going to be produced here. So for every 1 molecule of glucose, we get 2 ATP if only glycolysis happens. Okay, so for anaerobic conditions, I can draw a line here, and all that will happen is glycolysis. So we only get 2 ATP. If there's plenty of oxygen around, then these molecules, the pyruvate molecules, can go into forming, or go into the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain to give us 38 in bacteria, 36 in us. So quite a difference. If we don't have enough oxygen available to us, our cells will not get enough ATP in order to function. That is why when we don't have a good supply of oxygen, then we will die. So underneath this, we have, just like what we did with photosynthesis, we're going to see where is glucose used up. So these are the reactants on the left. Glucose, if you look at the diagram, you can tell right from here. Glucose is used up in this first stage, which is glycolysis. Okay, where's the oxygen used up? If you look at the diagram, the arrow showing oxygen going in is for the electron transport chain. So, electron transport chain. All right, now we look at the reactants. Carbon dioxide is produced during activation, so a small amount there, and also during the Krebs cycle. So most of it there. Remember, the Krebs cycle is also called the citric acid cycle. Water. If you look at the diagram, where the water is coming off is from the electron transport chain. Remember, when oxygen picks up the electrons and the hydrogens, it forms water. So water is formed in the electron transport chain. And ATP, we get a couple during glycolysis, none during activation. We get a couple during the Krebs cycle, but most is produced through the electron transport chain. So I cannot stress enough how important this is. In order to make everything past glycolysis run, we have to have oxygen available to us. Okay, this one I'm going to show you in class, and these ones you can read through, and we'll talk about it a bit in class, but I wanted to make sure that you understood more about photosynthesis and cell respiration for your assignment.